Good morning, all. That's my line too. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see everybody, and as they say, live in color, because we've been virtual for a few years. So, by way of a rolling introduction, my name is Gary Berg-Cross. I'm the president of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Conference, which is the primary sponsor of this F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Festival. This is actually our fourth fall event. We had some people here might have attended the wonderful event last night where we had a reading in honor of Richard Powers, and we're going to hopefully continue that day. I want to start by thanking our host, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Rockville, as well as our major supporters, the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County, the City of Rockville, and our members. We are a membership-oriented organization, and our members are listed in the program, which everybody should have. There's lots of things in the program, including short stories from our short story contest. I also want to thank our partners, Assistant Hands Home Care Potomac, Friends of the Library Montgomery County, Peerless Rockville, Rockville Cultural Arts Commission, the Writer Center, where our event was last night, and the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society. Now, of interest to many, our guests, the Friends of the Library, will be selling books outside. You probably saw that on the way in if you registered or picked up your folder. This book signing will go along with that after the afternoon award ceremony, and some authors may be available at lunchtime depending on their timing. The day's schedule and much more is in our program, and you will notice that some attendees, like myself, I find that I'm a president actually, based on this listing. I feel very military with this a little bit, but you'll see that various people have colored ribbons attached to their badges. So for your information, members of the festival organizing committee can be identified by a red ribbon attached to their badges, and if you have any questions, please ask one of them, and hopefully they will be able to solve all the problems. One thing I wanted to mention is that there is a internet connection, a Wi-Fi connection for this room, which is called the sanctuary. And the password, let's see, what is the password for that? It's relationship, without any capitals, right? Thank you. So besides the organizing committee badges, we celebrate our short story contest winners. They have blue ribbons attached to their badges, and winners of the art contest, which is new this year, have a light blue ribbon attached to their badges. The program also lists short story winners who provided a reading last week. So you actually have that in the program, and also these are available online. Now, as part of our wonderful tradition, we also have 11 Fitzgerald scholars, students from Montgomery County public high schools nominated by their teachers, and these scholars have been selected for honor, and their names and schools are listed also in the program, and they will be recognized in this afternoon's award ceremony. One note is that our festival has been well supported since its launch in 1996 on the 100th anniversary of Fitzgerald's birth by the City of Rockville, as well as other organizations in Montgomery County, and I think we have some of the city council members here today. Now, this year we have a new element of the festival, thanks to funding by the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County. So we have had an art contest, and we have first, second, and third place winners for that art contest. And with that, let me turn to Patricia Dubroff, who is the organizer of that contest, to tell you more.
Thank you, Gary. Well done. I just wanted to send a message to everyone from the mayor, Bridget Newton. Unfortunately, she now has COVID, and she sends us her regrets and wishes for a smashing success. So let's make sure we do that for her. I am thrilled that the committee decided to branch out from the creativity of literature to visual art. And we had our esteemed colleagues, Patrick and Lisa Sieg, who are local artists in Rockville and also curators, judge the artwork that we received. And it was a stellar sampling. We have one of our finalists, Therese Capel, is here in the audience. Her piece is all on display in the hall, so if you want to take a look afterwards, and you can talk to her about why she chose to make the piece she did. And the winning piece, Lillian Blum, she's fortunately in Italy painting. at the moment, but her piece is, I wanted to read her statement about why she made the piece, and she sends her regrets that she couldn't be here live. But we did make posters from her piece, and they are for sale at the bookshop. So she said, "Covenant is about the intersectionality and interdependence of nature, humanity, and technology. Our future depends on us honoring our roots, in preserving that from which we come. We might be the creators of the future, but unless we immerse ourselves in the more than human world, we will not survive. The sooner we start to honor the unwritten covenant that binds us together from fungi to AI, the sooner we will start to move towards harmony. We ignore and destroy the vast symbiotic system of which we are but a small part at our own peril." I think she gets it. Maybe she's a writer too. So I want to thank you all for participating in this year's art contest. Please tell your friends and neighbors who are artists in Rockville that we hope to do this again next year, and we'd love to see what they come up with. Thank you so much.
So now our major event of the morning. It's a great pleasure to introduce celebrated authors Richard Powers and Kim Stanley Robinson. Now I could spend a fair amount of time, perhaps even the rest of the morning, reading some of the honors that our two distinguished writers have, but your program includes long descriptions of them. So I think I'm going to be brief and read maybe a top line for each of them. Richard Powers has written 13 novels which explore connections among disciplines as disparate as photographs, artificial intelligence, mentioned in the artwork, musical composition, a very central piece of his thought, ecology, genomics, game theory, virtual reality, race, biology, and business, a short line. And his first novel, which I was privileged to actually have come across in paperback form early on, it was called Three Farmers on the Way to a Dance. And of course, more recently, we have the Pulitzer Prize winning Overstory. And on Kim Stanley Robinson, widely recognized as one of the leading living writers of science fiction, and of course now the near future in the great work on the Ministry for the Future. The Atlantic called his work the gold standard of realistic and highly literary science fiction writing. With that, let me turn it over to our two special novelists.
So here we are at the Fitzgerald Festival, and I was amazed and delighted to learn that Stan was in fact a great devotee of Fitzgerald growing up.
Well, it's true. I was an undergraduate at University of California, San Diego, about 50 years ago. And in high school, I had loved Shakespeare and murder mysteries, and that was it. And in Orange County, California, I felt like I was the only person aware of either one, but so it was kind of a bubble of, a very happy bubble of my own. As a reader, many of you will recognize this story. And then at university, my mom said, "You should be a lawyer, you love to argue so much." And I was studying history and political science, but literature just took me away. And then I had to catch up and read everything. And Fitzgerald at that point was one of the big three. Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Faulkner. And it took a while to remember Zora Neale Hurston and other Willa Cather and other women writers of that era who were as good as the big three, but weren't in the classes in the same way. And at that point, I read all of Fitzgerald, because I like to read in depth in the writers that I like. And he was good, and I hadn't read him since then. So it's about 50 years between readings. I just read his last three novels, and an interesting collection of stories not published in his lifetime called I'd Die for You. It's worth checking out those stories for the kind of stuff he was writing that he couldn't get published because they had him in such a pigeonhole that he was only allowed to write one kind of story. And after he wrote 30 or 40 of those, He wanted to do other things, but they didn't let him. So those are good stories. One of them set right here in Rockville. So yes, it's been an amazing experience. And I take it you've been rereading them also.
I have. My experience with Fitzgerald as a young man was not as extensive as yours. I did go to high school, which means I did read Gatsby. and I dabbled beyond Gatsby when I was young. And there wasn't traction there for me initially. I'll talk a little bit about this more later, so I won't go into that now. But my delight in coming back to him again after half a century is discovering that my early sense of him was entirely wrong. And there was so much more there that I had somehow learned to see through the course of writing 13 books and spending 40 years thinking about these questions. And one question is, this theme of the more than human for this year's festival, which I suggested to the committee, and which is so brilliantly encapsulated in the statement that Gary read. We could just read that statement and talk about that for an hour. This theme of interdependence and interconnectivity is also in Fitzgerald. And this realization that we have become deeply estranged from the more than human and need to refine it and reconnect is also in Fitzgerald. And the most famous part of his work that all of you will remember is this great attempt at the very end of Gatsby to imagine what this story, this human disaster, in this already greatly diminished island that he's describing, what that place looked like before we got to it. And that, to me, seems like maybe the way that we can pivot from Fitzgerald to the manners of literary urgency that I think we want to talk about together.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And you see in Fitzgerald an attention paid to the settings that his characters are in. So he's really a social novelist, and he's often about class. But the places that they're in, the alienation of these characters from, say, the beach on the French Riviera, where people are almost drowning, or it's just a background to their own social dramas. Fitzgerald's very aware of that, and in Gatsby, going through the Valley of Ashes, the kind of destroyed industrial landscape between the rich person's house and the city. These are not accidental. He's paying attention to that relationship, even though he's mostly concerned with class. And when Fitzgerald said to Hemingway, the rich are different from us, and Hemingway made his typical smartass reply, yes, they have more money. And, as if that was the only difference. But Fitzgerald was saying, no, that having more money has changed them in ways that make them different from us because they were poor writers. Well, that was true, and he studied that, and he wrote about that. But to go to the more than human, I think we have to shift, to our work and to that, and to the Earth Day, the growing awareness that the planet matters to humans.
But it's there in embryo at the end of Gatsby with this attempt to shift the point of view, from this doomed quartet, to off island, and to looking back at the fresh green grass of the world. And I thought I would tell a little story about my own personal journey back to that fresh green grass. And it started in Northern California, not far from where Sam has lived for a long time now. I was briefly on faculty at Stanford and living in Silicon Valley, which is itself the kind of Gatsby Central of our generation, where the rich have accumulated more money than even Hemingway or Fitzgerald could have imagined, and who consequently have created a culture that is deeply alienated from place. In fact, that has created a kind of fantasy of place interdependence. But the interesting thing about Silicon Valley is just above it, between the ocean and the valley, are the Santa Cruz Mountains. And, you know, I would go to dinner parties in Silicon Valley, and there would be these conversations among people saying, just stay healthy for a little while longer, because we're going to defeat death. Right? There's a design flaw in life, and our technologies are going to overcome it. That's a somewhat oppressive culture. And to get away from it, I would go up into the Santa Cruz Mountains. And up in the Santa Cruz Mountains are these extraordinary forests of recovering redwoods. When I first hiked in them, I didn't know that I had to add that word recovery, because a redwood in 100 years can look like it's already been on the planet forever. I mean, they are enormous, girthy, bulky, beautiful, tall trees that dwarf your sense of significance. But that's only a 100-year-old. And while I was hiking these trails in the Santa Cruz Mountains, there was one day when I came across an escapee, a tree that had somehow avoided the fate of the rest of the forest that ran the length of the Central Peninsula, a 1,200 to 1,500-year-old tree. And I suddenly realized that these trees that were, you know, merely 10 feet across were babies. And this monstrosity had been there since Charlemagne. And to stand in front of that tree and to look at something, you know, half the width of this room at the base, and, you know, a millennium and a half old, right, and as tall as a football field is long, was to change my sense of what life was trying to do. And there was this weird moment where I thought, you know, this entire mountain range was cut down. There would have been trees this size all up and down the coast. And they were cut down to build San Francisco, to rebuild San Francisco, to build the railroad. And the reason Silicon Valley is down there, and the reason Stanford is down there spinning out the digital age, is because these trees were up here. It was a very odd moment of connectivity, a sense of human history that we rarely tell about ourselves.
Yeah, we're coming out of a history of the planet and the biosphere as raw materials for humans to build civilization out of, and the disregard for the biological support system that the planet represents for us, the way that the biosphere is really our extended body, so that people were in effect cutting off their feet to build their house and then stumping around, is a recent realization that we still have not come to terms with, and we haven't invented the civilization or the economics that would direct our own activities as human beings to life support systems, which is to say our extended body, the planet itself, that your work as adults should be, you should be able to make a living from helping the planet rather than tearing it out. Now, California, there's a fine line between a lucky thing and a curse. In fact, the two are often the same thing. So California, the gold rush, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, these three stupendous civilizational events have all impacted California to make it a special place. My home, devastated landscape, the trees cut down, but also the Central Valley. people say it was the Serengeti of North America. The Central Valley was tule marshes, and it flooded in the springs, and then it dried out. It's a Mediterranean climate. That was treated as a factory floor for making food, and nothing mattered but to drain the wetlands, flatten things. As flat as this floor here, the Central Valley of California is actually flatter than, if you shrunk the Central Valley to the size of this room, the floor would be flatter than this, and turn it into a factory for making food, and all the wild animals are gone. And that's where I live, in the middle of a ecological devastation. Now, there are plans to bring it back, rewilding. This is a growing movement that recognizes our relationship to the biosphere and our dependence on it as being expressions of it. And so this is now a new story to tell, and I can see. Let's talk about you're writing about all these various topics that are of interest to you, and it's been a sequence of great novels, and then the tree thing.
Yep.
And when we met, I said, "What are you writing now?" I said, "Well, I'm doing a tree thing. I'm going to write about trees." And I was thinking about Tolkien and the ants, and I was thinking, you go, Rick. This is going to be fabulous. The trees are going to be walking around talking to us. And that's sort of true, but sort of not true, because it's so intensely a realist that you had to do the story of the trees through your usual methods of realist characters in a real American story.
Yep.
How'd that go?
You know, when I had this conversion moment, my road to Damascus moment, and I started to think about the stories that we tell about ourselves and how we got here, where we're going. And I became obsessed with this other kind of history, a human history told through all of the agents and entities that permitted human history, but like the underclasses of humanity have been kept out of the story and rendered invisible. I started thinking about my production as a writer. And as I read more and more about how deeply dependent on trees and plants and place we are, all truths that we've tried to eradicate through various kinds of technologies, but we've also tried to eradicate it through our arts. And I started to look at the ways that we've been telling stories in America, and I noticed that we reached a moment where we erased our dependence on the rest of the living world, or it became very hard to find. And I would read novels and still take the same kind of pleasure that we all take out of reading novels. But I'd say, where are all the supporting characters that make this story possible? And they weren't there. And that's where I began to think, how do we go back and use this form, which is so human-centric, and tell this other story, which is there is no humanity without the more than human world. Just as there was no Silicon Valley without the redwoods. And two things occurred to me. One was that actually the absence of the humans, or the absence of the more than humans from human stories, is a very new thing. That if you look at American literature in the 19th century, it would have been impossible to tell the story of who we are, where we're going, without bringing in place really deeply, and without bringing in all the affordances of the living world really deeply and profoundly. So old stories do. And in fact, most of world literature in most of the locations of the globe would never have dreamed to tell human stories without bringing in more than human. But there was another group of writers who never abandoned this idea that we have to think about life beyond the human, and that was the science fiction writers. that while literary fiction became more and more co-opted by a kind of capitalist vision, which is we're here in order to take dominion over the world and to monetize it, to instrumentalize it, the science fiction writers never stopped asking the question, what if the world at large, the living world, the universe, had different ideas than the human race? And this is where my friendship with you was, during this time was really a valuable touchstone for me to try to find vessels and forms that were also that looked like archaic literature or older literatures, indigenous literatures, but also looked to recover many of the things that science fiction never lost, which is there is a third kind of drama. If you remember these three touchstone, I got this in 8th grade, I'm sure it's still being taught in some form, right? That we have drama when there is internal conflict between values inside an individual. There is drama when my values and your values are different. And there is drama when what human beings want and what the world will allow is different. So the formula that I got back in the day was man against man, man against himself, and man against the elements. And notice the sexist language there too. But my point, what I wanted to look back to you about was those three kinds of drama exist in pre-capitalist literature, and they continue to exist in many outposts inside capitalist cultures, but primarily science fiction and speculative fiction.
Well, thank you for that, Rick. And I am a science fiction writer, and this has been, like California, a lucky thing, and also a kind of a curse, because so many people think, well, I don't read science fiction, and so they miss out on a lot of good stuff. And the luck of it is an intense intellectual community, and also a sense of being an outlaw artist, very valuable in America, to be outside of the academy and the official sources of approval for literature, and be, the creature from the Black Lagoon. It's a beautiful position because America values its outlaw artists. It's a badge of honor to be a crazy person coming, staggering in from the outside and bringing the news. So it's all good. I've loved it. But it also has been a limitation in terms of reaching certain audiences. But what it's given me and my community in literary terms is, okay, the relationship within yourself, very important. Then the relationship to other people, very important. The relationship to the planet, well, in science fiction, you arrive on a planet that's, well, all desert, and you have to cope, or you arrive at the planet where it's winter all the time, and you have to cope.
Or there are so many plants that want to get you.
Oh, you might get eaten by, yes, you land on the jungle planet, and this, which you can call the planetary romance, was very popular in the 1950s when rockets were there and were giving people the notion, well, we could go visit these places, which it turns out to be wrong, but it was a good story device for sure. Well, that always existed. Essentially, the ecological element was part of the story in science fiction and there to be put to use. So I would say, when Rick published the Overstory, I read it like everybody. I loved it, but I was thinking also, and I wrote to him about this, there's an understory to the Overstory. And the understory is you needed science fiction to tell the story you wanted to tell. And because you didn't, the young woman in the story who really is speaking for the trees, who has kind of become a tree medium, as in spiritualist terms, and dies off for unfortunate reasons. And at that point, the author of the Overstory is like Calvin beating up on Hobbes really badly. Characters are suffering beyond the need. Someone is thrashing that cast of characters that remains at the end of the Overstory in a way that was an excess of spiritual, psychological, unconscious energy. And I said, Rick, science fiction. And then we get Bewilderment. And I read the planetary romance chapters from Bewilderment last night. What a pleasure. These are beautiful chapters.
Was mine. I mean, you can imagine my little amateur late life dabbling in a form, and then hearing our great master of it read it in his voice was such a treat for me.
No, but these are beautiful. Rick is a gifted novelist, and so there's no special tricks. We are all science fiction writers in our own life. You make a plan, you say, if I execute this plan, I will get to a good place. That's your utopian science fiction story for yourself. If you're in the middle of the night, you're awake, insomniac, you're missing certain biochemicals that are very useful, and you begin to worry, and there's things to worry about, that's your dystopia. Things could go wrong, and maybe they already are wrong. So we're all science fiction writers. So once you take an interest as a novelist to give it a try, Rick said, well, what about empathy machines, this hokey old thing from the 1950s, where you put on a skull cap and suddenly you are reading other people's minds, telepathy, psi powers, Philip K. Dick, all this stuff is a little bit old-fashioned. Rick said, could I still do that? And I said, if anybody can do it, you can do it, give it a shot. And therefore, in Bewilderment, it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's the first time that you've done science fiction in the proper sense as something from the future has been described in the present. Now, always there are scientists in Rick's novels, and so fiction about science and scientists, that's a subgenre or a separate genre. You could call it lab lit, or you could just call it what Powers does.
The great thinker Bruno Latour, who just died last week, wanted to try to call it scientifiction.
Yes, but this is Hugo Gernsback.
Right.
1928, Hugo Gernsback with the first science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories, or whatever it was. Scientifiction, how clever. But no.
But to try to build on what Stan's just saying, so what my growing historical suspicion, and also my suspicion about my journey personally, was that we had reached a point in our ability to seemingly control the world through technological mediation, that we thought that third kind of story was obsolete. That there was no more drama there except in a nostalgic way, because we won that war. And this culture of human exceptionalism, we stand apart from everything else. The things that give us our extraordinary abilities make us not only quantitative, but qualitatively different from everything else alive. The only really important actor anymore in the world, because of our incredible technological leverage and prosthetic extension. That culture that says all meaning is ultimately going to be made by and for individual people. That's also a good capitalist message. And that meaning is going to be mediated through stuff, right? That the most meaningful thing that you can do is get bigger, grow, accumulate. Right? All of these cultural messages had somehow seeped into the literature to make it seem as if the only stories worth telling were those where individuals making meaning for themselves were colliding with other individuals making meaning for themselves. How do we bring that third kind back? Well, it disappeared from American literature. You can see kind of in the golden age when the technology was getting so strong that this kind of metaphysical battle that Melville was raging, or writing about, trying to find in more than human both an enemy and a source of great, powerful meaning, right? That disappears and gets replaced by this other idea of stories as basically keeping ourselves company here in this world. But now, see, here's what I think is happening in this moment, is as we all come to realize that not only did we not win that war, but we're about to be brutalized by it. Now fiction is waking up again to the need to tell a different kind of story, an older story and a newer story, one in which we are not the only characters.
Yeah, I can only agree with that, and I just want to point out that the Powers novel is almost a singular genre that he's created of his own. And this is partly because in what has been called the program era, post-war American literature went into the university systems and English departments, and it changed with MFA programs. So people were being taught how to write for the first time. It used to be that writers would stagger out of their hometowns and try to get published. They get published or not, and they were really quite singular. You can tell a Faulkner sentence from a Fitzgerald sentence. But the MFA program said, well, effectively it came down to rules, and it's been anatomized very beautifully in a book called The Program Era. Show, don't tell. This came out of Hemingway. Finding your voice. That maybe is Faulkner. And then write what you know. Well, there are mutual contradictions in these three, such that you can't actually do all three at once. So already you've got a problem. But I would say that one of the things that science fiction always did was ignore those rules and even reverse them. And I often tell student writers, tell, don't show, because you are not a mime here. You are actually telling people a story. So tell, don't show. Don't say his brow furrowed. Say he was angry. That kind of thing. And then write what you know, but we don't know anything, any of us. So you actually have to write what you don't know. You have to write the other. And so you write what you don't know. And then find your voice. I mean, what I would say is be a chameleon and find the voice of your characters and try to get out of the way and not even be there. But one more thing, though. Show, don't tell kills exposition, where you have to just show people things in living scenes, dramatized scene after dramatized scene after dramatized scene. And the thing that makes the Powers novel different is that exposition has been seamlessly put into the novel, so you learn a lot about AI or DNA and how scientists work in the lab as a new story that other people aren't telling because they just didn't know enough or they weren't interested in it. They didn't think the story was there. This whole world is being invented out of laboratories, and yet literature was never in the laboratory, which is a peculiar miss. So there was always something special before the Overstory going on in the way that you could incorporate science into literary fiction, as they call it now, which is the program era fiction. And that's how, for me, as a reader, your novels stuck out. And there's very few others that you can point to also doing the same kind of thing.
Well, I love what you just said, and I wish I had known all of those precepts 28 years ago. But I'm learning them now. The challenge remains, and it's a mess. I mean, we know as readers that the great joy of fiction, as we recompose a story when we read, is that for a while it gives us the ability to be somebody who we're not.
So true.
To really see the world through the eyes of someone whose trajectory has been entirely different than ours, whose values are entirely different, whose hopes, fears, and dreams are different than ours. And it's profoundly moving to us to not be ourselves for a while. And that's also the great joy and delight of our profession. I mean, we get to wake up every day and take the road not taken. And try to see the world through someone else's eyes. But now you see, if we're to survive the future that we've brought upon ourselves, it's going only to be by hugely increasing our capacity to make that empathetic leap beyond our species and to see what life itself wants and needs and hopes and fears. Now, how do you put that into a novel where everybody's readerly literacy and expectation is that novels are stories about people told through the points of view of people? And that's going to be the great challenge for younger writers, how to bring the more than human back into a form where most readers are still only going to be able to identify through human characters. You struggled a bit with this in ministry. You were telling an enormous story about the fate of mankind, of humankind, and how we're going to be able to get out of it. But you still needed to create individual people who were going to carry that load, because that's how we read.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, I love novels. They are, in effect, my religion. These precepts back here in the colorful wall are literature teaches you those. And you get to live other lives. And so these poor Silicon Valley tech billionaires, if you don't read fiction, you think, well, I need lifetime extension. I need to live 500 years. But if you read fiction, you will have lived 10,000 lives by the time you're done by an act of the imagination. It's a huge gift, and it requires an active participation as a reader. You have to be generous, you have to be creative, you have to be imaginative to turn these words on the page into an event in your head. Some people can do it, some can't. But if you have it, it's a blessing for you. And then, okay, say you want a novel that does the non-human, that does history, that does even the future. You've got a form problem, but it's only a form problem. And the novel is extremely capacious. You can try all kinds of things in novels. And for Ministry for the Future, one thing that I found was the eyewitness account, where indeed you're telling, not showing. I was in Paris in May '68, and suddenly I was throwing paving stones at a police force, and I was just a kid, but now, 25 years later, it made me what I am today. Well, these stories are amazing, and they're told in 2 pages. So the novel is peculiar. You need 500 pages to tell that story? Well, maybe not. Maybe you only need the 2 pages. So you begin to be propulsive. You begin to summarize, and summarization is something that Rick can also do. The powers that develop when you go beyond show, don't tell are rather immense and make the novel in many ways more powerful than the movies. Because although the movies can show you things, they can't tell you things. They can't say, he worked for 10 years and never got anywhere and he felt like a dog in the kennel. How do you movieize that? You can't, but you can write those kinds of sentences. And Rick writes those kinds of sentences all the time. I myself in ministry just said, let's try every possible form that literature has ever given us, including the Anglo-Saxon riddle and memos from office meetings and stuff you don't want to actually have dramatized because it's too boring. So you give the notes from that meeting and that becomes that chapter. It's a way of playing games, and it's a way of making the novel fun again. And so in a way it was an opportunity. Form problems are opportunities.
And speaking of fun, we wanted to set aside about a third of the session for questions. Yeah. And we've reached that point, so
yeah.
that's...
whoever would like a question, the mic is going to be brought to you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for this. So, question, comment?
Ooh, a quick first grade person, that's what I'm in.
Gentlemen, pleasure to meet you. Thank you guys so much for coming in. I really like hearing what you have to say. This is for Richard, Mr. Powers. I read Bewilderment. I'm a special educator, and I write science fiction on the side. What was your inspiration for the character, the child?
So, Bewilderment, Overstory was this kind of sweeping operatic book. It had a very large cast, 9 principal characters. It had many physical settings, and it had a large temporal scope, a couple hundred years actually, if you include the backstories. Bewilderment is almost the opposite of that. It takes place in 2 locations with 2 people in a little bit over a year, in time frame of 1 year, basically. It's also a first-person narrative. So the story is told entirely by the father of an unusual, excitable, and very earnest and troubled son, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, in the course of the story. So your question is, where did the 9-year-old come from? And I had an answer when I was writing the book, and I have an answer now. And they're not entirely the same. When I was writing the book, I thought that Robin, the boy, was coming basically from 3 children who I knew, who were all exceptional, who were all troubled, and who were all very intense. And one was a niece on my wife's side of the family who basically saved herself through drawing. She was a compulsive drawer when she was little, and it allowed her the space and the calm and the satisfaction that she needed to get through some very, very tumultuous years. And she is now a happy adult. So Robin's need to constantly make things visual and to in a sense, to pre-memorialize endangered species by making drawings and paintings of them. That came from my niece. I also had a nephew on my side of the family, my sister's son, who was the gentlest and sweetest guy growing up, but who could explode into unimaginable rages and provoked almost in an abstract way by a sense of injustice. He did not make it to adulthood. And in a lot of ways, Robin is a kind of memorialization of my nephew. There was also the son of a colleague of mine at the University of Illinois, who a lot of Robin's speech mannerisms and the quirky things that Robin would do came directly from my colleague's son. My colleague has since died, but I'm good friends still with the son, and it was a pleasure to remember what he was like as a child. What I realized after the fact is that this book really was in many ways a personal anthropology. That kid, I was deeply probing and remembering and recovering the strangeness of who I was when I was 9.
Just a quick one for Mr. Powers. In the Overstory, was there such a thing as a chestnut tree that survived for many years in the Midwest?
I got the idea. So the book opens with the story of the chestnut blight. America's perfect tree. Where I live in southern Appalachia, 1 out of every 4 trees was a chestnut. And they ran all the way up and down the coast. They go up into New England, and they came all the way down to Georgia. And they were an extraordinary tree for almost every reason. And a blight that started at the beginning of the 20th century wiped them out. And by 1940, there were virtually no adult chestnuts left. And you can still see chestnuts. In fact, when I hike in the Smokies, I see them all the time, but they rarely survive more than a few years. They mature, they start to fruit, bark edges, and they get the blight. There are great efforts now to reintroduce this tree, which, I mean, we can't begin to imagine how central that tree was to American life throughout that immense region. It was deeply implicated into American history. And it's all gone. Now there are these efforts now to reintroduce it through Berg-Cross, breeding the tree with the Chinese chestnut, which has blight resistance, to get to the point where you have a tree that's 99% American chestnut in the genome, but has that resistance. It's been much more complicated than they've imagined. But there are programs that are showing great promise. But in the novel, I have this Norwegian immigrant bring chestnuts accidentally in his pocket into the Midwest and plant them there, way outside the native range of the tree. So when the blight comes, these trees that are far outside the native range survive. I got the inspiration for that. There were actually a couple pockets of cultivated chestnuts that were grown outside the native range that are still extant. And there's a pocket in Oregon, in fact. But there's also one in the upper Midwest. There's a grove of chestnuts in Wisconsin, in the far north of Wisconsin. And I just thought that's really a great way to connect again, to find a way to connect this human story that we all know, that immigrants move into the interior of the continent with the tree story, and to weave those two into an interdependent kind of narrative.
This side.
Thank you. I've been struggling to understand Homo sapiens' role in the evolutionary scheme of things. So if either of you would like to write a novel to explain that, I'd be so grateful.
Thank you. Well, here's what I can say about that. We, as a species, are a couple 100,000 years old, but our lineage goes back more like 5 million years, and then all the way back, mammals, etc. So what happened? Nobody knows. But what I've been saying to kind of spark people's imaginations is that we were technological before we were human. That the hominids that were our immediate family precursors in Africa and in the old world generally, they began to use fire and stones to do things. And at that point, their brains began to grow. And the thing that people don't know, but at some point, language. And so Temple Grandin is very good on this. Everything in the brain is conserved in evolutionary terms. You got the lizard brain that keeps you functioning. You've got the mammal brain where you've got your feelings and emotions, etc., that are generated there. And then you've got the human brain, the prefrontal cortex. It grew like a balloon. In these 200,000 years, in terms of evolutionary speed, the brain grew as fast as it could and got to the point where it can't grow any bigger without killing women when they give birth. So a natural limit was hit at an extreme difficult point. And so something's going on there, maybe language. All this story, maybe you all know this story already, but I reframe it to say, you have to remember. And I wrote a Paleolithic novel about what we were like 30,000 years ago to think about these very things. You have to remember, we're still those creatures. We still have that DNA. Nothing has changed in our DNA for about 50,000 years, except for lactose tolerance, if you haven't. That's about 17,000 years old. Other than that, we are those creatures still. So this strange surround that we live in, so much time inside buildings, so much time looking at screens for the young, so much time removed from the natural world. These things our brain craves the earlier stuff. And when we get it, like, oh, we're on vacation. But you could do it in daily life also. We crave the earlier, the things that grew our brains. If you do them now, you walk down to your creekside and you throw rocks across the stream and see who can hit a tree branch first. And actually, people talk about the expansion of the brain in order to be able to throw a rock and do the trajectory analysis to be able to hit the rabbit, to kill it and eat it. This is absurd, but it's also maybe true. if you remember and think about these things as you live your life, you will be healthier. And health is exactly synonymous with happiness. So it's worth thinking about these things.
I don't know. I mean, I wake up every morning with your question. And I'm writing now about trying to juggle three incommensurable time frames of evolutionary unfolding. And one is the time frame of the life molecule itself, which has been unfolding over a frame of about 4 billion years. And you know, none of us is good with big numbers. You know, a billion here, a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking real time. You know? But a few strokes before midnight, along comes culture. And as Stan says, that's unfolding on a vastly faster time frame, right? Well, if you think of the evolutionary clock as being marked out in these enormous eras that basically make a 4 billion year day, culture on the order of 100,000 years is a very fast clock. And you know, we think of, you know, we go into the graveyard at St. Mary's where Fitzgerald is, and we look at a grave from 1830, we think that's ancient history, and it's nothing, right? It's a moment, a breath. But that's because culture has so vastly accelerated the ability to unfold, to change, to experiment, to run permutations, to replace one way of thinking with another. And now we're on a third time frame, which is the time frame of the encoded world. Right? And since about 1970, we've been creating another kind of more than human entity, agent, which will, I think, ultimately be a living thing, but unfolding even orders of magnitude faster than culture. And we're giving our story over to those stories. We're already living in the algorithm age. And there's no question that even in this room, you know, even the oldest folks of those of us in this room have been deeply changed in our ability to read and in what we read and how we read by digital algorithms. Right? And if they continue to unfold at the rate that they've been unfolding, we're talking about trying to come to terms not just with this intractable problem of Homo sapiens who's been changing the world so rapidly through culture, but by more than humans that we have ourselves created that are going to be operating on an unfolding time frame that will be so far beyond our ability to control or think about.
Yes, I'm wondering, kind of almost along those lines that you were saying, and you were discussing before when you mentioned about how the book can be an opportunity to put yourself emphasizing into someone else's position. I'm wondering, when you read or when you write, how are you changed? Are you changed? And I'm not talking about in that momentary flash of pleasure of indulging. I mean, what part of the act of writing or of reading ultimately do you then absorb into your being and become? Do you, as you write, change yourself by what you write?
Do you want to go? You go.
It's
You go.
a deep and
I have to
wonderful
think.
question, and,
I have to think.
Yeah, for me, leaving the house, entering into the human world, is to adopt a goal-oriented and a existence. Right? Reality is what I will be accomplishing, or doing, or affecting. Right? And writing is the opposite of that. It defeats time. You know, when Stan said, when you read, you will live 10,000 lives. When you write, you stop attempting to achieve something, transact something, get something, meet someone, make something happen. And you immerse yourself entirely in presence, in simply attending and seeing what's there. And we get that. You know, we get that in our day-to-day. Something happens, the sun comes out, we hear a beautiful thing, or we come across a tree in late October, you know, a dogwood that's gone, you know, this marvelous burgundy, and we stop, and the teleology disappears, and we're simply present, we're simply attending. The thing about writing, the thing that has made it an unbelievably lucky way to live a life for me, is that it is a constant daily encouragement to spend vast amounts of time just being present and just attending to what is there outside of me.
Yeah, I'm still pondering this question. I don't know how to answer it because I've never been anything but a writer, and I've co-evolved with it. And for the Fitzgerald Scholars, I'm thinking back, I was a high school student, and my high school English teacher, Mrs. Catherine Lee, and if I understand it right, your teachers have nominated you for this award. They've given you a gift. That's cool. And Catherine Lee gave me a great gift in that she believed in me. Well, this was quite amazing. And it launched me. And I had senioritis in my senior year. I didn't do anything in that English class. She was quite disgusted with me and kept giving me C minus, D plus. You're not doing the work. And I wasn't doing the work. And she gave me the Best English Student of the Year award, similar to yours, anyway, because she knew I cared the most about books. So writing, yes, this contemplation thing, I have actually spent the last 15 years sitting in a chair in my front courtyard looking at exactly the same view to the west with a maple tree doing its seasonal thing overhead and the sun going from overhead down to the left and back up again. Well, that's peculiar. It's like being a monk or some solitary mystic, and I'm not that kind of person. So I do it, I love it, but why? Because at the end of it, I need to talk to people. I'm a social person, and I've lived my life as if I put myself in solitary for a lot of every day. Maybe, well, I've enjoyed it, but how it's made me hungry for human contact and for communal enterprises is one thing that it's done, because it's somewhat of a sensory deprivation tank. And then afterwards, you go out into the world, and it's like you're taking LSD. Oh my God. Look, oh, these people are so amazing. There's a sentence by Thoreau. I got into the stagecoach, and everybody was just talking to each other, as if that was easy. And so I guess it's a complicated thing, yeah.
We have time for one more question?
Sure.
I know we have lots of hands.
This will be brief. I'm curious. I want to go back to Bewilderment for a moment. First, I started it on audio, and then I got up to the library and saw that Robin's dialogue was italics, and I was very upset with you. I just wanted to know. But I wanted to ask, because it's such a tight, taut, gorgeous, full book, I wanted to ask what was deleted. What was deleted? Were there scenes that maybe stick out to you that you put on the chopping block?
Yeah. You've triggered so many directions that I'd love to run. First of all, I'm not sure how you felt it. I thought that the audio was loved. And Margot Ballerini is the reader. He's one of the best audio readers there is alive today. And because it is this first-person monologue, because it's a book entirely dominated by one man's voice, it works so well as an audiobook. But tell me abstract discourse?
Well, because it was italicized in the book, and meeting Robin, loving Robin, I listened for the first maybe 2 hours out in the yard, so I was just with Robin. And falling in love with Robin, and then getting the book and noticing that, well, I don't want to spoil things. His dialogue is italicized, which indicates something about him.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, no, I can't spoil it either, so, but I hope that what it's indicating is a slow realization and not a rapid one. But, you know, when people teach narratology, they talk about the moment of realization of people inside the story, and then the moment of realization on the part of the reader. And so much can be leveraged in the power of a story, the suspense, and the emotional power of a reveal by changing when a reader realizes something and when the characters are going to realize that same thing. So that was part of that device. What ended up on the chopping block? Well, I think we both maybe work a little long in the first draft. Is that right? And it's got to come in, you know. This is so idiosyncratic. I mean,
Or you've got to add more.
sometimes, yeah. Or things have to come out in order to put the right stuff in. And that's what happened in Bewilderment. The entire first draft of the book was wrong. I mean, I had an old, embittered woman undergoing a treatment. So the two main characters were the person who invented the technology. This is when I was first helping Stan about the conception. And a person who was the subject of the technology simply as a paid subject, very cynical, whose cynicism starts to disappear through the interaction. And then I realized that this book is actually picking up the torch from Overstory and wanting to engage this question of if we know what's happening and we know why it's happening, why can't we muster up the will and the desire to make it stop happening? And I thought, when is that question most powerfully addressed? And when does it put us most on the spot? And I realized my lead character has to be 9 years old, because you can't turn away from a 9-year-old who's saying, explain that to me. Right? Don't you know, this week we got this latest World Wildlife Report. About 69% of wildlife disappearing since 1970. Right? So how do you tell a story that makes an adult who has accommodated that fact and who has gradually accepted it as a necessity? How do you make it? How do you ask that question again in a way that demands answers without evasion? So that entire first draft disappeared when I realized who it was that I needed to build the story around, that the final version of the story happened in a matter of months.
I have a very difficult task of trying to draw this to conclusion because of much time. I want to thank our speakers. As a master class, we didn't necessarily conversation on video so that there can be more what I can share. And so looking forward to that. Now it's time for the break, and we will resume at 1 o'clock, and our keynote talk will be by Alice McDermott, followed by a topic introduction to the Fitzgerald scholars that I mentioned before. Yes, that will take place again in this room. Lunch is outside, past the registration desk, and volunteers can come again. So thank you again. We are waiting. I just wanted to announce that for people who are registered in Robert Musil's fiction and nonfiction nature writing, that workshop, thanks to the glorious weather, will be outside. So I'm sure it'll gather somewhere out there when we break for that, and you can enjoy outside and do some nature writing. Oh, Alice is here. I'm sorry, I was expecting to see you over here, so I wasn't looking. So let me actually kick things off. Okay, so a wonderful morning, followed by what I know will also be a wonderful afternoon. And so it is a great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Alice McDermott, who is actually the 2010 recipient of the Fitzgerald Award. Now, her talk is entitled Stories and the Quintessence of Dust, so we have story commonality in here. As I said in the morning, our program includes wonderful information about each of our speakers, so I'll just say a few words from the program and let Alice come up and give her talk, which is on Stories and the Quintessence of Dust. Alice has published 8 novels and an essay collection called What About the Baby? Some Thoughts on the Art of Fiction, which is very relevant to what we heard this morning. Her 8th novel, The Ninth Hour, was a finalist for the 2017 National Book Critics Circle Award and the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. And with that, let me introduce and make space for Alice.
Good afternoon. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. I know you enjoyed the morning conversation. Wasn't that wonderful? Oh my gosh. Thank you. So happy to be here. So I'll launch into this, whatever this is, and hope the conversation will continue on into the afternoon and even further. So storytelling and the quintessence of dust. It was late January of this year when Jackson Breyer called to ask if I'd like to address the Fitzgerald conference today. The brilliant Richard Powers, he said, had suggested the theme of story and the more than human. Jackson wondered if I might manage to say something in keeping with this theme. I wondered if I could manage to say anything at all in front of the likes of the brilliant Richard Powers. An hour or two before Jackson's call, my daughter and I had been discussing what had taken place here in our nation's capital just a little over a year ago. On that day, I had left my desk at lunchtime to turn on the news, an unusual circumstance for me, but one that had become habit during 2020's lockdown, when I found myself obsessively tuning into Governor Cuomo's daily harrowing and yet oddly sustaining press conferences, as the governor became, in the midst of so much grief and misfortune, a kind of reassuring dad. Well, we all know how that turned out. On January 6th of 2021, however, I tuned into the news at midday simply to witness the ritual certification of November's election, the beginning of the end of the current president's tenure. We all know how that turned out as well. Anyway, just before Jackson's call, I was telling my daughter about my astonishment last year, my quiet dismay, as I watched the insurrection unfold in real time on our family room TV. My daughter quickly amended my recollections, as daughters will do, by reminding me that she had actually been at home on that day and had come into the family room when she heard me, quote, yelling my head off. The way she described that winter afternoon, I had not watched the Capitol invasion with quiet dismay, but utter disdain. I had, in truth, stood just inches from the television screen, poking at it and crying out, "Look at that asshole! Oh my God, look at that one, and that one, look at this jerk! Who are these idiots?" With my memory so recently refreshed, it's probably no surprise then that when I heard Jackson say, "more than human," I thought, no, not more than, better than. Storytelling and the better than human. I mean, butterflies and bees and every manner of beast, dogs especially, purple mountains, lakes and stream, fungus, forest, the non-metaphorical swamp, the planet, the stars, the whole of the created non-human world. Surely more than human refers to everything that is not human, and so refers to that which is better than, superior to. Because, let's face it, all the jerks, the fools, the stupid, metaphorical assholes in creation reside in that middle ground between the less than human and the more than human. All the jerks in creation are us. Surely, I thought, the theme of this year's conference should be storytelling and the better than human, which made me recall Hamlet, and a well-worn bit of Shakespearean cliche that often comes to mind, not because I was an English major, but because I had a father who was educated in the New York City public school system at a time when all students were required to memorize such things. A father who, all his life, loved to demonstrate his skill by declaiming at our dinner table, "What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty and form and moving, how express and admirable, in action how like an angel, in apprehension how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, and yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights me not, nor woman neither." Storytelling and the better than human, damn right, I thought. What isn't better than dust, than us? A frame of mind that led me to cast a similarly cold eye on the idea of storytelling itself. Of course, in our loud-mouth hubris, we humans see ourselves as the only creature who tells stories, but honestly, what human being, a tip of the hat to Roald Dahl, weaves a better tale than the clever spider, tip of the hat to E.B. White? What human writer can contain in a few lines the sweep and the scope of century-spanning lifetime as the trees do? Tip of the hat to Richard Powers. Another Shakespearean earworm came to mind. In the mouths and minds of the likes of us, isn't all storytelling essentially a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing? Which led me, this time in English major mode, to think of Faulkner's Benjy in The Sound and the Fury, and then some lines from that other Williams' famous Nobel acceptance speech. He said, "It is easy enough to say that man is immortal simply because he will endure, that when the last ding-dong of doom has clanged and faded from the last worthless rock hanging tideless in the last red and dying evening, that even then there will still be one more sound, that of his puny, inexhaustible voice, still talking." Puny, inexhaustible, still talking. Words that might well describe the very voice that spurred last year's insurrection, no? The very voice that haunts our discourse still. Worse yet, at the time Jackson called, I was reading a play called Ballygungare by the Irish writer Tom Murphy. Ballygungare translates as the place without laughter and tells the story of a senile Shaughnessy, a professional storyteller, who tells the tale of the laughing contest that gave the town its name. A story that the demented old woman repeats and repeats to her long-suffering granddaughters, but never finishes. Here are some pertinent, "what a piece of work is man" lines from Tom Murphy's play. "Sure, we weren't meant to be here at all, making mock of God's prize peace, the structures and system. Oh, I have wrestled with enigmas all my lifelong years. I've combed all of creation, and in the wondrous handiwork of God have found only two flaws, man and the earwig. Of what use is man? What utility the earwig? Where do they either fit in the system? They are both specimens desperate, without any control, and therefore unfree. But God will not be mocked, especially when he was so clever at creating all things else. Still, God must have said, I'll leave them there and see what transpires. Storytelling as the act of this flawed, dusty quintessence of dust shouting in its puny, inexhaustible voice, if not stop the steal or hang Mike Pence, a tale anyway, full of sound and fury and endless, desperate repetition, signifying nothing, that seemed about right. What I'm trying to say is that it was with some misanthropic glee that I told Jackson that I would address you today on the subject of storytelling and this quintessence of dust. An opportunity perhaps to bemoan the hubris of this wide world's only literal, that is, non-metaphorical, storytelling creature, us. A creature who more and more I was beginning to think delights me not. Although I have to confess as well that I chose the title because I loved the word quintessence. I loved the adorable Cupid doll sound of the not quite harsh quint, and then the sustained sibilance of the double S's and the gentle suspiration it takes to get to the final ence. Even utterly detached from its meaning, it's a beautiful word, a petit boucher of sheer music. But, of course, it's difficult to keep even the loveliest of words detached from its meaning, something all writers know and most politicians eventually find out. I suppose at the time I was thinking of the meaning of Shakespeare's quintessence as it relates to quintessential, that is, the most perfect or typical of a quality or class, or the intrinsic and central constituents of its character. And certainly it's this familiar definition that makes Hamlet's wry turn of phrase so delightful to the contemporary reader, or at least made it delightful to me at the time of Jackson's call. It's one thing to be the quintessence of style, or of wisdom, or of good taste, but of dust? Are there hierarchies of dust? Dust is dust, isn't it? As Genesis so soberly puts it, from dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return, the biblical authors never bothering to distinguish just what kind of dust we're talking about here. The worst of dust or the best of dust hardly seems a distinction worth noting. And while Quintessence has its musical charms, dust, the word itself, not so much. As for its definition, fine particles of matter as of earth, something worthless, the surface of the ground, or, to the British, refuse ready for collection, as in dustbin. Surely the biblical author and translator who chose the word dust to tell us where we come from and where we're going would object to Faulkner's proposition that it is easy enough to say man is immortal simply because he will endure. Dust to dust is hardly the kind of immortality or endurance we might hope for as we make our way, all of us inevitably, to dusty death. And yet, thinking about the word itself, an occupational habit, I considered how many writers, how many foolish storytellers full of sound and fury have made some pretty good use of it. There's Faulkner's own Intruder in the Dust, Ruth Prower Jamvala's lovely novel Heat and Dust, or the marvelous YA prose poem Out of the Dust, and Was, A Handful of Dust, which brought to mind two of the poets, Eliot for one, who lent Waugh this title. Writing in a state of mind not unlike my own last January, Eliot composed 100 years ago these grumbling lines. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either. Your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. I thought, too, of the great lyric poet, Edna St. Vincent Millay. And you as well must die, beloved dust, and all your beauty stand you in no stead. This flawless vital hand, this perfect head, this body of flame and steel before the gust of death or under his autumnal frost shall be as any leaf, be no less dead than the first leaf that fell. This wonder fled, altered, estranged, disintegrated, lost. Nor shall my love avail you in your hour. In spite of all my love, you will arise upon that day and wander down the air obscurely as the unattended flower, it mattering not how beautiful you were or how beloved above all else that dies. And Rupert Brooke. When we are dust, not dead, not undesirous yet, still sentient, still unsatisfied, we'll ride the air and shine and flit around the places where we died, and dance as dust before the sun, and light of foot and unconfined, hurry from road to road and run about the errands of the wind. Or this absolutely lovely poem by the poet Danusha Lamouret that popped up in my mailbox in the pandemic's dark hours. Dust. It covers everything. Fine powder, the earth's gold breath falling softly on the dark wood dresser, blue ceramic bowls, picture frames on the wall. It wafts up from canyons carried on the wind, on the wings of birds, in the rough fur of animals as they rise from the ground. Sometimes it's copper, sometimes dark as ink. In great storms, it even crosses the sea. Once, when my grandmother was a girl, a strong gale lifted red dust from Africa and took it thousands of miles away to the Caribbean, where people swept it from their doorsteps, kept it in small jars, reminder of that other home. Gandhi said, the seeker after dust should be humbler than, the seeker after truth shall be humbler than the dust. Wherever we go, it follows. I take a damp cloth, swipe the windowsills, the lamps taut shade, run a finger over the dining room table, and still it returns, settling in the gaps between the floorboards, gliding the edges of unread books. What could be more loyal, more lonely, more unsung? Well, maybe not so unsung after all. This dust of which we fools are the quintessence. A conclusion that encouraged me, spurred by the poets, to look again at that lovely word. Thanks to the footnotes in my battered college Shakespeare text, I was reminded that quintessence also refers, quintessence, to the fifth essence of ancient philosophy, an essence that is both distinguished from the four elements that compose matter, air, fire, water, earth, and extracted from them. According to Aristotle, this fifth essence is the very ether that fills the region of the universe occupied by the gods. And while this quintessence is derived from those familiar four elements that make up earthly life, it is distinct because it is incapable of decay or change. Moreover, it moves with the perfect circular motion of the heavens, while those other four elements are, by their very nature, transient. Before I go any further, I should probably apologize to the real academics among you. I'm really not qualified to be tossing around Aristotle. But in a recent article about the centennial of the wasteland, I found a T.S. Eliot quote that gave me some comfort about the shallow depths of my own academic credentials. Eliot wrote, "It is better to be spurred to acquire scholarship because you enjoy the poetry than to suppose you enjoy the poetry because you have acquired the scholarship." Because I had long forgotten the scholarship, the Aristotle, behind these famous Shakespearean lines, my impulse to link them to storytelling, to pair them with the notion of storytelling and the more than human, was, as I said, more misanthropic than celebratory. A certain willingness, given the times, to admit that everything else that exists is clearly more than, better than, we humans. But in recalling what our writers and poets have done with the humble word dust, in recalling the wit of Tom Murphy and the romantic lyricism of Edna St. Vincent Millay, and coming upon T.S. Eliot's gracious absolution for the non-academic lovers of poetry among us, and of course, coming face to face with Shakespeare's brilliant and multi-layered use of words, perhaps for the 1,000th time since I first heard my father recite them at my childhood dinner table, I found my own impatience with us, we only human, we no more than human, abate. Poetry, great literature, will do that to you. And I began to see that what I might really want to say about storytelling in this quintessence of dust has more to do with words, both the simplicity of them and the endless musical complexity of them. Words that both constitute and conjure that fifth essence, the ether of the gods that does not change or decay. An imaginary place for sure, as all worlds constructed merely of words must be. A place that moves with the perfect circular motion of the heavens as dust does, as all good stories must. Stories that, whether they rise to the level of poetry or only aspire to it, might remind us of what we share, all of us dusty humans, might remind us of what this quintessence, this fifth essence reveals. I have reached the point in my reading life, probably safe to say in life in general, when rereading familiar novels and stories has become revelatory in a new way. Not because I've forgotten so many of the fictional scenes and portraits I once studied. Memory is tenacious when it comes to the written and the recited word, as my father might attest, but because these scenes and portraits return to me as something brand new. They return to me not as something I once read before or studied, but as something I once actually lived. They return to me with the depth and breadth and meaning of personal experience, as the memory of a lived experience of my own. A couple of examples come immediately to mind. The infirmary scene in Joyce's Portrait of the Artist, the first act of Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, Mrs. Ramsay's summer dinner table in To the Lighthouse. Of course, I remember the entire book or play. Of course, I remember the scope of the stories they tell, how things turn out. But embedded in those stories are moments that strike me on rereading as something more than a part of the whole, a memory of my own, a vivid sensation of my own returned to me, made vivid again by the author's words. I've been thinking of late of how to describe these moments, these mergers of memory and experience and imagination so unique to our experience of the printed word, and I now wonder if they might be called the quintessence of reading. Quintessence in both its familiar meaning, the embodied pinnacle, the essence of a thing, storytelling in this case, in its purest and most concentrated form, but also with a nod to Aristotle's definition, the fifth element that is the ether of the gods. This is what we do, we humans. We raise our puny, inexhaustible voices in storytelling. And in doing so, we send our words like so much swirling dust into the ether, where they become the eternal atmosphere, the breath, the life of the immortal and unchanging. I move to quote another American Nobelist in this regard. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, Saul Bellow said, "The essence of our real condition, the complexity, the confusion, the pain of it is shown to us in glimpses, in what Proust and Tolstoy thought of as true impressions. This essence reveals and then conceals itself. When it goes away, it leaves us again in doubt. But we never seem to lose our connection with the depths from which these glimpses come. The sense of our real powers, powers we seem to derive from the universe itself, also comes and goes. We are reluctant to talk about this because there is nothing we can prove, because our language is inadequate, and because few people are willing to risk talking about it. They would have to say, there is a spirit, and that is taboo. So almost everyone keeps quiet about it, although almost everyone is aware of it. A novel, Bellow goes on to say, is balance between a few true impressions and the multitude of false ones that make up most of what we call life. It tells us that for every human being there is a diversity of existences, that the single existence is itself an illusion in part, that these many existences signify something, tend to something, fulfill something. It promises us meaning, harmony, and even justice. And now I find myself, circular motion indeed, recalling how I poked at our flat screen and shouted my ineloquent disparagements on January 6th. How a year later, my first cynical thought when I heard the phrase "more than human" was to recall those open-mouthed jerks with their flagpoles and their bear spray and their mad chants. Now I find myself thinking of Faulkner's contention that man is immortal, and I realize that his words strike the ear in these climate crisis days as doubly naive. Man is not immortal. He is indeed dust to dust, and all the signs indicate that we will not endure, that even his puny, inexhaustible voice will be silenced in the red tide of the last evening of our reign of stupidity and hubris and destruction. And yet, thinking of Bellow and Tolstoy and Proust's true impressions, thinking of my own indelible quintessence of reading experiences, I am moved to object to my own knee-jerk disdain. Disdain not only for the jerks among us, but for all of us who are not more than human. I am moved, in short, to allow my impatience to abate. In Tom Murphy's play, the winner of the laughing contest, the old Shaughnessy describes, is to be determined by he who laughs last. The storyteller's granddaughter, who only wants the old woman to get to the end of the story, asks what possible topic would keep the contestants laughing near forever. Misfortune, the old lady says. It is perhaps particularly, but certainly not exclusively, Irish to recognize that we humans are creatures beset by misfortune, the inevitable result of the whole dust to dust thing, but also an inevitable consequence of our own stupidity and hubris, since so much misfortune is of our own making. What we've done, what we continue to do to the earth, for instance, is certainly a misfortune of our own making. But the stories we tell, in order to point this out, to make a point, to sound an alarm, to incite reform, will, it seems to me, inevitably fail if our stories do not also aim to discover those true impressions, those moments when the written word is transformed into personal memory, when the language deployed transcends story itself and shows us to ourselves as both human, created from and subject to the four elements, but also made of that fifth universal ether that words alone can create. Stories that allow us to say there is a spirit even though we can't prove it and our language is inadequate and the phrase itself is taboo. Stories that aim perhaps not for the more than human, but the quintessentially so. In my time teaching aspiring fiction writers, I would, on occasion, propose a playful experiment. I'd clear us all out of the classroom, and then one by one, I would send each writer back inside with a notebook and a pen, and the instruction to describe what you see in whatever order of perception these things appear to you. When that was done, when we had a collection of paragraphs describing the desk, the chairs, the rug, the quality of light, etc., I would select one member of the class to return to the empty room and assume whatever posture struck them, as long as it wasn't obscene. They could stand, they could sit, they could open a book, they could write on a board. And then, one by one, I would send the other students back inside again with the same instruction. Describe what you see in the order in which it is perceived. Inevitably, In this round of the experiment, each new paragraph would begin, "There's a guy writing on the board," or "a woman standing at the window," or "a person who appears to be asleep is on the floor." The point being, the I, the mind and the heart too, perhaps, is a heat-seeking instrument. It will be drawn to its own. So too the storyteller's eye, heart, mind, so too the eye, heart, mind of the seeker of stories. Stories, alas, require the human. Perhaps this begins to explain, if explain we must, why our storytellers turn their attention so consistently to our own dusty selves. The reading assignment I would use to accompany this experiment can be found in the opening chapters of Thomas Hardy's Return of the Native. I'd ask my dutiful students to read the first chapter, "A Face on Which Time Makes But Little Impression" is the title. 4 lovely pages that describe the landscape of Edgden Heath. It begins like this. A Saturday afternoon in November was approaching the time of twilight, and the vast tract of unenclosed wild known as Edgden Heath embrowned itself moment by moment. Overhead, the hollow stretch of whitish cloud shutting out the sky was a tent which had the whole of the heath for its floor. A tip of Thomas Hardy's hat to Stanley Robinson's own Tent Cities on Mars. I then asked my students to gauge their interest and enthusiasm, to take their emotional temperatures, you might say, when, after these 4 pages of gorgeous description, they encountered the first line of the second chapter. Along the road walked an old man. Even the most generous readers among my students recognize that with the appearance of the human, their attention changed. With the appearance of the human, the story began. Or, as Hardy puts it in his title for this second chapter, humanity appears upon the scene hand in hand with trouble. And now I'm once again recalling those idiots at the Capitol, those raging idiots, quintessence of dust, who spurred me to this rambling rift in the first place. I'm thinking if story itself demands the introduction of the human even into the most sublime of non-human landscapes, then, in story as in life, trouble will follow. Misfortune, as Tom Murphy's Shaughnessy puts it. And if trouble and misfortune will inevitably follow any story about us humans, the creatures all stories must be in some way about, then so too will come, hand in hand with trouble, the risk of disdain. The risk of an impulse on the storyteller's part, no less than the story seeker's part, to poke a cruel finger at the human image and shout, "Look at this asshole, look at this idiot, gaze upon this fool." It hardly seems merely coincidental to me that the evidence of our abuse of the landscape grows more and more apparent at a time when our abuse of one another has also grown ragingly, glaringly clear. Mass shootings and mass incarceration, cruelty as public policy, cruelty as entertainment. The dispossessed, delirious with anger, the comfortably enlightened, delirious with disgust. Bellow's notion that for every human being there is a diversity of existences, that the single existence is itself an illusion, that these many existences signify something, tend to something, fulfill something, promise us meaning, harmony, and even justice, can hardly be proposed, never mind sustained, when the ether in which we encounter one another is polluted by hatred, dismissal, intellectual and emotional disdain. One more poem comes to mind. I'm sure many of you will recall how Auden's poem, September 1st, 1939, became so much of our public discourse in the weeks after 9/11. It begins, I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. Pretty much what we were all feeling in those dark days might still be feeling, come to think of it. But the line from the poem that was quoted more than any other, or so it seemed to me, was from the third stanza. We must love one another or die. Of course, the scholars among us were quick to point out that Auden himself came to dislike this poem intensely. He left it out of his collected works and thought especially that that one often quoted line was dishonest and glib. We must love one another and die might be more accurate since, well, as Edna put it, and you as well must die, beloved dust. But just between us, I suspect Auden meant that line sincerely when he wrote it, since it is, to my mind, a perfect summary of his Christian faith, a faith that contends that it is love that redeems us, even from death. I say this just between us because I suspect this is another subject that is taboo. Nevertheless, I'm inclined to propose, in a more acceptably secular context, that we must love one another or die might also be the perfect summary of the storyteller's faith and obligation. The challenge of life, of art, of our own continued existence on this planet is to love the world and all the creatures in it. The problem is that those creatures include us, annoying, maddening, careless, tip of the hat to F. Scott Fitzgerald, idiots that we are. The problem is that without us, in all our awfulness, the storyteller's eye, the story seeker's heart and mind will grow cold. The question becomes then, can we love the world and all the creatures in it? Can we love one another without resorting to, taking comfort in, promoting and perpetuating the notion of better than, more than? Can we tell our stories about one another in this divided time without resorting to censure, disapproval, disdain? Gandhi's quote, as it appears in Danusha Lamire's wonderful poem, is of some resonance here. The seeker after truth should be humbler than the dust. Look, it takes nothing away from the other than human universe with its perfect motion and its complex wonders and its endurance in the face of all that we have done to undermine it, to say, nevertheless, that we prove ourselves to be this absolutely remarkable quintessence of dust through our words, our poetry, our stories. Putting aside all science, nature, geological, ecological, zoological metaphors we so brilliantly employ, we are, in fact, the only creature that tells stories. Stories shaped of words, of music, of memory, of the imagination, stories that reveal, if only briefly, leaving us again in doubt, the true impressions, the quintessential moments that connect us, all of us, to one another, to the universe itself. Stories that remind us there is a spirit, transcendent, enduring, unchanging, glorious, and above all, human. No more than human. Thank you.
Well, that's another wonderful journey, and it shows you we deserve a tip of the hat yourself. And it's another example about what stories and great presentations can do for us. We're a little bit ahead of time, so it was suggested to me that we might take a 10 or 15-minute break before we go to the celebrations of the scholars. Okay, so come back in 10 or 15 minutes at 2 o'clock. Is available for purchase out there where the books are also. So with that, and now I'd like to have here to tell you about the Fitzgerald Scholar Program and to introduce the scholars is Taryn Treskovich, who is our festival liaison from Montgomery County Public Schools.
Thank you, Gary. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again to Alice McDermott for her words. I'm sure you all found them just as compelling as I did. I have the distinct pleasure of starting the awards this afternoon for the 26th annual F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Festival. And as that number grows, with each passing year that we're able to meet for this occasion, it's just a true reminder of how long this celebration has made an impact on our community by bringing together scholars, students, teachers, authors, and others, all in recognition of the power of literature. As the festival liaison to Montgomery County Public Schools, I have the honor of being involved in 2 different student awards throughout the course of our festival events. Today's award, which recognizes the selected Fitzgerald scholars, actually reflects the second means by which the festival recognizes student excellence in literature. In a previous event on October 6th, several high school students from Montgomery County were recognized as winners of our annual short story contest. That's always a remarkable evening for the attendees when they get to hear the winners' stories. I'd like to take just a moment now to recognize them again. So congratulations to our 4 student winners of the short story contest: Eileen Lau, Alina Amin, Leanne Tan, and our first place winner, Allison Su. Each of their winning... Each of their winning short stories and those of the adult winners can be read in full on our festival website, and they're also included in today's program. The second opportunity for student recognition, which I have the honor of sharing today, is the selection of the Montgomery County Fitzgerald Scholars, which celebrates the achievements of high school students who excel in literary studies and writing. Each of these students was nominated by their teachers and will receive a certificate commemorating their accomplishment. They will also each receive signed copies of books from Kim Stanley Robinson and our honoree Richard Powers. We'd like to thank everyone involved in purchasing and providing these books to the students. In preparation for speaking to you all today and preparing these remarks, I asked this year's scholars to tell me a little bit about themselves and their reasons for loving the study of literature. I really wanted them to guide my thinking as I was preparing to talk with all of you. And unsurprisingly, this is a group of very well-rounded and very accomplished young adults. Among their ranks are student journalists, minority scholars, leaders of book clubs, engineers, artists, and activists. But what stood out to me most was how similar their comments were about literature. Nearly every scholar, in some way or another, mentioned the power and reach that literature has in our society. One scholar described an appreciation for the required partnership that exists between an author and a reader. Another mentioned the ability of literature to teach us more about the world around us and ourselves. Many scholars express the value of literature as a unique means by which we can further open our minds and make connections to different time periods, cultures, and concepts. Those comments then led me to think more about what's going on in my own life and led me to think about a year-long project that my AP literature students are currently undertaking. At the beginning of the school year, during the first week, I asked each of them to draft a project proposal for me, in which they must choose a series of novels to read throughout the course of the year, which captures the zeitgeist or spirit of a particular era. This year, their topics range from the American film industry in the 1950s, to LGBT activism in the Stonewall era, to the Roaring Twenties, featuring another reading of The Great Gatsby, of course. This array of interests is vast and compelling. I'm always impressed by just what their minds come up with. But ultimately, each of them comes to recognize an important fact, just like our scholars did in their comments to me. It's not only through primary sources and newspapers that we learn facts about our world. Our understanding of life is rooted in the soil of fiction. I'm grateful every day that I get to experience that fact over and over through the eyes of my students. And again, as I get to experience the day talking with the Fitzgerald scholars. What a gift to myself that I've chosen a career where I get to fall in love with literature through the eyes of people who are experiencing it sometimes for the first time. So without further ado, I'd like to recognize each of the students who was nominated by their teachers as Fitzgerald Scholars for 2022. They're not all here with us today, but I'm going to read all of their names anyway. For those that are present, if you would please come up and receive your copies of the books and your certificates. Amelia Campbell from Wheaton High School. Caroline Chow from Churchill High School. Elizabeth Durso, Richard Montgomery High School. Jada Guerra, Magruder High School. Isabella Juarez, Gaithersburg High School. Noah Lewis, Quince Orchard High School. Isabel Acuna Marin, Albert Einstein High School. Malak McDonald, Rockville High School. Langston Muller, Albert Einstein High School. Tegan Nam, Northwood High School. Fraze Suzuki, Northwest High School. And last but not least, Sasha Vasensky from Montgomery Blair High School. Congratulations again to all of our 2022 Fitzgerald Scholars and the short story contest winners. You all have a very bright future ahead of you.
It is now my great pleasure to reintroduce Kim Stanley Robinson, who will say a few words about our honoree Richard Powers, after which we will present him with this year's honor, or plaque honor.
I'm going to set this up for Rick. Yeah. thank you, everybody, and especially the Fitzgerald Society, and to Richard Powers for inviting me to do this. It's a real pleasure. So, it's a great thing to be a reader and have some favorite novelists whom you follow. And you discover them necessarily with one book, and often that remains your favorite ever after of that writer because it's the first one and it has the power of surprise that the others can't bring. But then you read the others and they're all different and they're all yet coming from the same sensibility, the same medium has been inviting in spirits to speak, characters. And it's like a companion, even if you've never met them, which often you don't. And sometimes you can't because they've passed away. But there's a special pleasure when it's a living novelist and you know that there are more books to come that you can look forward to that makes your cultural life more exciting than it might be if you didn't have these new gifts to look forward to. So Powers has been like that for me for 10 years now, and he's written a lot of novels. I have not read all of them, but now I've read a lot of them, and it's been a true pleasure. And I want to run you through his career, just noting things that I found significant along the way. Three Farmers on Their Way to a Dance, a strange title, and not a novel that I read until quite recently, his first novel. And I think you can divide novelists into a quick, easy cut, a dualism. Those whose first novel was a fumbling about, maybe even a botch, and doesn't really represent what they're going to be like. And those who, right from out of the gate in their first novel, have done something that will represent the rest of the work. And I, being in the first camp, am very envious of people in the second camp. And Richard Powers, if you look at that first novel now, you see lots that came later in different forms. And you can read that novel now with its intense interest on the passage of time and what art can save from the past and tell us from the past, but also what photography is. Is it an art? Is it an accident of physics? And this, to me, now can be read as a meta level. That novel is, what is the novel? Is it a camera? Is it a possession? And the main character in that particular novel is thinking about photography and the past in a way that now looks to me to be a new novelist thinking about what is this form, this art form, the novel, and getting some great answers to then run with. And after that, every few years, there was a new novel, interesting and different. The topic was different. The voice in it seemed to be a little bit different. There were similarities, and yet it was hard to get a fix on what this novelist was up to. And I would say, for me anyway, as a reader, the Goldbug Variations from the early 90s and then Galatea 2.2 from the late 90s, these were unusual novels in that they were about scientists doing science. They were also about the scientific subjects that these all too human scientists, these human beings pursuing a particular what could you call it? Obsession, a game, a pursuit, a life course. Scientists are funny people, and the way that they track their work is such that they could be intensely interested in whether turtles appeared 50 million years ago or 70 million years ago. And I mean intensely interested, and devote a career to that. Well, this bespeaks a certain mentality that novelists, both like and not like, that they often haven't really considered the humanity of scientists. They're said to be I mean, Mr. Spock is a beautiful image of the scientist, half human, half Vulcan. And that rationality of the Vulcan side is always undercut by the raging emotionality of his human side. Pretty damn good portrait of the scientist as a stereotyped, cliched character. Love Mr. Spock. But to go into more detail about the real characters is something that Powers brought that you don't see very often. The scientist as hero, the scientist as a character in a novel, a protagonist. And not only that, but you can learn a lot about what DNA meant to the human understanding of ourselves from the Goldbug variations, and also you can learn an awful lot about computers and artificial intelligence from Galatea 2.2, and books from the 90s that nevertheless are utterly contemporary if you read them now in their revealing of the fundamental philosophical problems that are being engaged by these scientists as they try to tease out the details of reality in whatever way they're doing it. So that's fiction about science. And I think we talked enough about genre this morning that I won't go on about it again here. But what I would say in terms of Powers' career is that people reading these books were, to a certain extent, they were impressed, for sure, always been well received, but they were puzzled too. And there began to be questions like, who is this guy? Why can he talk authoritatively about all these different fields? They're not getting the novelist's trick of putting everything you know on the page and then implying that it's 10% of what you know and then looking extremely knowledgeable. It works really well. But cerebral novelist. Now, if you read the books, the Spock-like raging emotions, the intense love lives of these scientist protagonists is such that to call this a cerebral writer shows how confused people were. And besides, what's cerebral? What they meant was there are ideas here. There's science here. There's content other than human soap operas here. We're learning some news here. Oh my God, how cerebral of him to do that in a novel, which is supposedly going to be a lesser thing that is always concerned with the personal lives of characters that are familiar enough, and they often have a disability of some sort or a quirk of some sort to make them a character, but nevertheless are not studying another field that you then also learn as a reader. This is what Powers was doing then. And then came the Overstory, which I'm going to come back to the ones that I've skipped. But the Overstory, the science involved was the science of dendrochronology, of trees, of ecology, connected web of life. A novel about that specifically through our arboreal brothers and sisters, and making these connections. And also, again, the protagonists were obsessive compulsive in their study of something alive, and something happened with that book. That was the book of the moment, and maybe it still is, because our feeling of removal from the natural world that supports us, that is our extended body, is so intense that a novel that began to explore that problem, reveal that set of, that kinship that we have, even with plants. And I want to take an aside and say that revealing our kinship with our fellow creatures, our fellow mammals, is important and good to do, and I love it dearly. Our horizontal brothers and sisters. That's John Muir talking about all the wild creatures. To extend that to plant life, to trees, and have it picked up as it was by the broad general public who took to it with a certain hunger. People wanted that story. And then they ran with it, and it's been a phenom. And it's changed our discourse, our public discourse, our sense of what we are. And that's what literature can do. Now, all that said, I want to say that a novel depends almost entirely on It's characters. And Alice McDermott in her keynote referred to this, the inevitable return to the human, and that's fine. We anthropomorphize. If the protagonist of your novel happens to be a gopher, then you just think of it as George Gopher. It's a human being, and a very small and furry human being. We anthropomorphize everything, but in this case, for the novel, we read them for characters, for getting inside other people's heads. Well, that's not easy. We never do that in real life. We want it, we don't get it. You could be looking at your partner in the face and telling them a long, involved story. They could be thinking about, are the Dodgers going to win tonight? And you never know because you're not inside the other person's head. And then you read a novel and you are. So this comes from our keynote speaker, Alice McDermott. I expect all characters in fiction to insist on their own authenticity. That, I think, puts it right. All of the characters, that makes it very hard to write a villain, by the way, because everybody has their reasons, as Orson Welles once remarked. And so the villain is thinking of themselves as perfectly justified and doing the right thing at all points, or at least they can make excuses for themselves at all points. So villains are hard, but characters need to believe in themselves, and then the novelist gets out of the way. It's not a particularly personal genre. It's not like lyric poetry. I feel this, I feel that, like an aria in opera. The novelist says, I'm not here, it's a negative capability, as Keats said. I get out of the way, the characters speak, and then the reader is in someone else's head. And that has happened so often in Powers' novels. It's the key to all the rest. It's why the ideas are also interesting, is that the characters are intensely felt. It's as if, another phrase from McDermott, I expect fiction to be inspired. That's good. This is religion, not just as an expression of a religious point of view, but literature has a religion, that there's nothing but individuals. There are no generalizations that hold. It's one case study after another, if you want to put it in scientific terms. But in literary terms, it's character after character after character. So, I'll end with this. Everybody has got their favorite, right, of the novelists that they love. And when a book like The Overstory blows up, as your agent will call it, then it tends to put into a certain shadow all of the other books by that writer. And there's many and many a reader who read The Overstory and then went on to read the next bestseller and never read all of the rest of these books. Well, you're missing some good ones, and I want to particularly recommend The Echo Maker. That's no surprise. That won the National Book Award and was a giant hit in 2005 or whenever it came out. So, and yet a truly great and beautiful novel to be read and remembered with the rest of them, and yes, my favorite. And then lastly, this always happens also in a long career, the book that you love that didn't seem to make the same mark as the others, that slipped in under the radar, that sold poorly, that didn't get much reviewed, whatever. And of course, like any other parent of a large brood of unruly kids, your favorite, because somehow overlooked, I would recommend to you all a book called Generosity. On the one hand, a typical Powers novel, because the scientist's involved, although he's an English writing instructor in this case, but connected with scientists, like a certain somebody at University of Illinois, thinks they've discovered the gene for altruism, so that you could explain it almost as a mutation. On the other hand, as the protagonist learns through the course of this great novel, swift and shorter than most of the rest of them, we only survive as humans by way of altruism. So the story that tells it is swift and powerful. And I want to remind people that it might be central to Powers' work, that he's always thinking about generosity. So, Rick Powers.
Thank you again, Stan, for bringing everything alive. It's another master class this afternoon from our speakers. And it's always wonderful to have a writer as well as an avid reader commenting on these things. They're very insightful. So at this point, we have the time to give an honor to present the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award for Outstanding Achievement in American Literature by the F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Conference this day, October 15th, to Richard Powers. Thank you.
Thanks. Hiya. I feel like I can retire now. Especially after such a generous introduction. Thanks, Stan. Thanks to everyone. But I have to single out Alice McDermott for that spectacular, spectacular keynote. Deeply moving, deeply playful, deeply true. Never have I loved man more, nor woman neither, than when I read Alice McDermott. There is also a very troubling, disturbed side to reading her too, for me personally, which is, as I turn the pages, I feel, I don't have a lot more time. I have to learn how to write. So beautiful. When I learned that I was going to be given an award named after F. Scott Fitzgerald, I felt a pleasure much more befitting a younger man. When I learned that receiving the award would involve having to say a few words about Fitzgerald's influence on my own work, I felt all the anxiety of an old guy. Fitzgerald wrote about intensely social people with material longings and class aspirations, while I wrote, as Stan mentioned, about loners and solitaries searching for pattern and meaning in all kinds of extra-social and intellectual pursuits. I honestly wasn't sure what I could bring to the Fitzgerald party. In an understandably famous quip, Mark Twain once said, "When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. When I got to 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in 7 years." Reading Fitzgerald as a young man, I thought, these stories are just about people making themselves miserable over class, wealth, and privilege. Only in my 60s, now, coming back to consider the work, do I realize these stories are all about the damage to the individual inflicted by a culture that forecloses on any other kind of meaning. I was shocked by how much the man had learned since I first read it. There is, in Fitzgerald's characters, an immense hunger for connection not mediated by stuff, status, and admiration. That hunger also became mine, and in retrospect, I can see how Fitzgerald's critique of commodity-mediated human exceptionalism helped to lead me back into a living world, where meanings are constantly being made in ways that dwarf us all. His writing has given me something else too, a thing that seems at first glance smaller, but probably isn't. I mean the way that his sentences stop and at times burst into fountains of purely ludic pleasure, even inside a tragic frame. Santayana in the comic Mask says, What could be more splendidly sincere than the impulse to play in real life? To rise on the rising wave of every feeling and let it burst, if it will, into the foam of exaggeration. Life is not a means. The mind is not a slave or a photograph. It has a right to enact a pose, to assume a panache, and to create what prodigious allegories it will for the mere sport and glory of it. Play has become increasingly important to me as an old guy, and the eternally young Fitzgerald is an enduring reminder of how the game is best played. So given these thoughts about reader reevaluation, thoughts that actually dovetail nicely with Alice's reflections on rereading, and considering how the reputational revision that makes Fitzgerald's own story so poignant and powerful, I thought I'd revisit a piece that I wrote just before writing the Overstory. I've only written a handful of short stories in my life, and this may be the one that means the most to me. It's called To the Measures Fall. The epigraph is from Borges. The title, of course, is from Shakespeare. All titles are from Shakespeare. The epigraph is from Borges. We are made for art, made for memory. We are made for poetry. Or perhaps we are made for oblivion. In this read-through, you are biking through the Cotswolds when you come across it. Spring of '63. 21 years old, your junior year abroad at the University of York, after a spring term green with Chaucer, Milton, Byron, and Swinburne. Remember Swinburne? Year one of a life newly devoted to words. Your recent change of course has crushed your father. He's long hoped that you would follow through on that Kennedy-inspired dream of community service. You, who might have become a first-rate social worker. You, who might have done good things for the species, or at least for the old neighborhood. But life will be books for you from here on. Nothing has ever felt more preordained. Term's out, and it's time to see every square mile of this island. Bicycle clips, a blue guide, transistor radio, and skin-hugging rain. Villages slip down valley roads as twisty as the clauses in Henry James. The book turns up in a junk shop in an old Saxon market town whose name you will remember as almost certainly having an M in it. Among the rusted baby buggies and ancient radios, you find old cooking magazines, books on fly tying and photography, late 50s spy novels with cardboard covers worn soft as felt. The thing pops out at you. To the Measures Fall, by someone named Elton Wentworth. There's nothing else like it in the shop. It's a fat tome with rough-cut pages in deluxe tooled binding. The dust jacket has disappeared, but the front matter suggests that you know all about Mr. Wentworth already. Born in 1888, the author of 12 previous books and the winner of awards too numerous to mention. The first line reads, "A freak snow hit that year, 2 weeks after the sand martins returned to the gravel pits near the South Downs." The first few paragraphs sketch out a hard-pressed town, Watton-on-Wold, much like this one with the M in it. On page 3, the author comes clean with the date, 1913. On the last page, a village search party finds the body of a young amputee captain who served at the Somme, lying at the bottom of the said gravel pits. Only 7 years have passed, but the lilting opening cadences have changed into dark fragments beyond all family resemblance. The book seems to be a sweeping portrait of rural England before and after the First World War. And for whatever reason, some local resident has dumped his copy at the junk dealer. You check the title page, copyright 1948. Aside from 2 bold exclamation points at the end of chapter 1, the pages are unblemished, perhaps unread. Penciled into the upper right hand of the inside front is a price, 10 and 6, exorbitant. You draw £7 a week for student expenses. A 3-course Chinese dinner in Station Road cost only 4 shillings, and lunch in the canteen is half that. A 12-inch LP is only £1, and even a 4-minute call back to the States is cheaper than Mr. Wentworth's book. Half a guinea for a used novel you'd never heard of? It's crazy. But something about that opening line is too strange to resist. Besides, you've just devoted your life to literature. You graze the start of chapter 2, where Trevor, a spindly farmer's son with Addison's disease, baffles his parents by insisting on going to university. You need to know how that beginning can reach such an end. The shop's owner is a beaked old man with a gray hairline like a cowl slipping off his head. It's humiliating to bargain with him, but you're desperate. How much do you offer the junk store owner for his used book? You are, by the way, female. No known complications of any size. Lots of folks think you shouldn't be out biking alone, even in the Cotswolds. See page 214 to 223 of Mr. Wentworth's epic. How much would you have offered for the book had you been male? You buy the book, lug it around on the rest of the bike tour, take it back north with you, but somehow fail to read it. When summer ends, and with it your English fantasy, you're shocked to discover how many essential novels you've bought and haven't gotten around to. Now the problem is packing them all into a suitcase lighter than 44 pounds. You could mail them to the States, but they'd cost more to ship than you spent to buy them. You resort to the time-honored system of 3 piles. 1, keep for all time. 2, suspend in purgatory. 3, cast out into the outer darkness. By the evening before the homeward flight to the Measure's Fall is stuck stubbornly in limbo, along with Wheelock's What is Poetry, James Purdy's Malcolm, The Bull from the Sea by Mary Renault, John Brayne's runaway bestseller Life at the Top, and Updike's The Centaur, which has gotten mixed reviews. Life at the Top is small and light and might be tricky to get hold of in the States. Who knows how long Updike will be around? Malcolm, on the other hand, is already on every undergraduate syllabus list in the country. Renault, Guilty Pleasure, is the one you'd really love to have in your carry-on. The further adventures of Theseus and Hippolyta with sun-drenched temples, earthquakes, and possible human god miscegenation. How better to fill 8 hours of captive reading? But your bag will hold only 4 more volumes. Choose which 2 books get dumped forever. Wentworth makes the cut, if only as a souvenir of that magical cycling tour. Weirdly, browsing the bookshop in the Oceanic Terminal at Heathrow, you see a reprint of one of the earlier novels about coal miners in Wales. It's a penguin with that pale green spine synonymous with great literature. There's a jacket quote from Winston Churchill calling Wentworth this island's Balzac, our much revered, much imitated national asset. And another from Dame Edith Sitwell, DBE, calling him England's most distinguished living author of the novel of Community. That national asset makes him sound like a hulking stone country house that pauperized aristocrats give away for tax deductions. And most distinguished feels a bit backhanded against mods, rockers, the angry young men, and beyond the fringe. But two immortal literary lions praise this man to the skies. What an incredible deal, getting the junk shop owner to take 8 shillings. Clearly, the balding shop owner didn't know what he was selling. Far out over the Atlantic, approaching Greenland, a twinge of conscience eats away at you. What good is all the cultivation in the world if you're just going to cheat ignorant people? How much should you have paid the shopkeeper? Exceed his proposed price if needed. Back in the States, you look up Elton Wentworth. He isn't England's most distinguished living anything. He died right around the time that you realized you'd sooner sell cigarettes from a shoulder tray than go into social work. In addition to sheep in the Cotswolds and coal in Wales, he's done Lincolnshire fishermen and 3 generations of Brummie factory workers. He's not England's Balzac. He's the James Michener of the Midlands. You read the first 100 pages to The Measures Fall, hacking your way through thickets of dialect. The prose can be brutally beautiful. But the semester starts, you fall in love, get deflowered, watch Kennedy get killed, see the Beatles invade, get high and listen to Coltrane and discover Heller, Ellison, Ferlinghetti, and Bellow, writing that flows across the page in huge, bright swaths you never knew English would permit. So World War I was a bad scene. Aren't we over that yet? And what was Wentworth doing, bringing out a book wrapped in Edwardian nostalgia 3 years after Dachau? You graduate in spring and pack up your worldly possessions again, just as the USS Maddox fires on 3 patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, letting Johnson widen the war in a country that, until recently, neither you nor Wentworth nor the vast majority of that year's most celebrated living novelists could have told apart from fiction. Does the book go to Goodwill, Salvation Army, or the 25-cent pile at your graduation lawn sale? You survived 2 years of graduate classes, the general comprehensive test, flubbing the question on Tobias Smollett, marriage to a Faulkner guy, and a grueling 400-book special field exam on the Electra complex in post-war American prose, a subject you hate already long before your committee can lob the first question. All the while, Biafra, Black Power, the levitation of the Pentagon, My Lai, back-to-back assassinations, the siege of Chicago, street warfare, and city centers burning in an annual summer ritual. Drugs are everywhere, making people see God or murder their families. Books go surreal, psychedelic, and sometimes you wonder whether they're causing the mayhem or just profiteering. The dissertation, Your Baggy Monster, becomes a 4-year excuse to read everything except those writers you threaten to write about. On a hot June Thursday early in the new decade, right around the day when 5 men break into the DNC headquarters in DC, you find yourself patrolling your shelves like a hopeful bidder at an estate sale. It's a shock to come across that deluxe binding, which you distinctly remember throwing out a long time ago. The Cotswolds, Cruel Joke, Elgarian Imperial Residue. You take it down and browse. You stop to fix dinner for your husband, who, invalid of high modernism, cannot fix it for himself. But you're back at Wentworth until 4 a.m., when you end up down at the bottom of the Cotswold gravel pit, 1920, your throat feeling like you've been taking swabs with a pipe cleaner. You don't know what hurts more, the swirling moral turbulence of the book, or the belated discovery that everything you thought about the thing is wrong. You missed everything. Register, mood, irony and ambiguity, subtleties of characterization, narrative arc, even basic plot points. You can't read. It's like finding out at 30 that you're adopted. You're not yet sure it's great literature, but the thing that took you underwater and held you there for the better part of 13 hours, and 2 days later, you're still winded. Its single history-slapped village is a whole world whose heft and weight and strange, sinuous tangle of syntax stands for nothing but itself. Its portraits, particularly Sarah, mother of doomed Captain Trevor and furtive wife of idealism-scarred Francis Beck, seem so clearly ripped from microscopic observation that it's cheating to call them fiction. This is not your life. It's not your time or place. It's just a scrap of torn diary floating up from a scorched village. What does the thing want from you? Give the book a final grade. Fail, low pass, pass, pass with honors, highest distinction. You make your husband read it. You do the Lysistrata thing until he does. This is a mistake, as he reads it way too fast. Very well done, he reports, wanting his sugar cube. Skillful. First-rate social realism. Why haven't more people written about this guy? It isn't skillful. It isn't social realism. You read it again, taking a week this time. On the third take, the book gets more troubling, more weirdly allegorical. You can't put your finger on what bothers you. Something to do with being moved against your better judgment. You lie awake on a hot August night, wondering how a thing might be good and real and true for a while, then made irrelevant or worse by later events. You've gotten very close with your thesis advisor. In fact, if you remember right, you're sleeping with him. The two of you are in an actual bed somewhere, in the dark, a luxury you can no longer imagine how you managed. Maybe it's an OPEC oil crisis thing. Turn off the lights when not in use. The two of you are playing that old favorite. Which classic would you never dare admit to anyone but your lover in the dark that you haven't read? You offer Silas Lapham, and he ups the ante with Billy Budd. And you try to trump with Sound and the Fury, which he blows out of the water with Huck Finn. You ask him if he's ever read any Wentworth. He just snickers, thinking it another game. You obsess on the thing. You read all the criticism. Most of it damns itself with due diligence. Trevor Beck and Erickson's theory of social development. Wool, surplus value, and class unrest in Wentworth's Watton on Wold. No article has an insight strong enough to explain why you should be reading it rather than another book again. You learn all kinds of things about Elton Wentworth, some of which you wish you hadn't learned. Blacklisted for pacifist activity under the Defense of the Realm Act, went to Russia between the wars and came back extolling the enlightened socialist state. Right up until Munich, he was a prominent appeaser, But come September 1939, he turned British super patriot and personal propagandizer for Churchill, which helps explain the latter's jacket blurb. After the war, he fought decolonization tooth and claw in a series of interviews with dozens of natives on 3 continents who all declared the British Empire the best thing ever to happen to its colonial subjects. At the age of 81, he was jailed for 3 months for violent demonstrations against nuclear weapons. In short, the author of that autonomous, unjudging book with no villains and fewer heroes, where every moral position is plausible but flawed, is himself a hopeless, card-carrying, repeat-offending true believer. Grade Elton Wentworth's public performance. Separate marks for form, style, and intent. In one of the competing Wentworth biographies, you come across a photo of a note to Wentworth from Sir Winston himself. The letter's signature vaguely resembles the inked scrawl that you've never paid attention to on the inside front cover of your copy, underneath the penciled price that now fills you with shame. The signature in the reproduced note reads Winnie. The drooping, obscured squiggle in your copy looks more like H.H. Clunlunch. You're insane, of course, hallucinating from over-research. No way on any plausible earth that a book belonging to one of this century's most famous personages could end up in a junk shop in the Cotswolds. Winston Churchill, Nobel laureate in literature, isn't going to write his name in his bloody books. If found, return to House of Commons, London. And the Queen marks her stuff with a Dymo embosser. You try to erase the penciled price for a better look, but you only succeed in smearing the signature. You look up every occurrence of Churchill's signature on record in the university's library. There is a similarity. The book gives nothing else to go on except the 2 bold exclamation points at the end of the first chapter. The one on the right seems distinctly Churchillian. You take the book to an appraiser, but you get paranoid. This is exactly the kind of scenario where the naive get bilked. On your next trip to the city, you bring it to an antiquarian whom you've bought from many times. He listens to your theory with a tight, embarrassed smile. He says that even if you do get the signature certified, which could cost considerable blood, toil, tears, and sweat, the simple signature without any further marginalia may not greatly increase the book's value. Given the dicey nature of the scribble, you might not want to pay for appraisal, but he's willing to give you $50 for the copy, for being a good customer. $50 could buy 2 years of used novels. Deal or no deal? You keep the copy for reasons reason doesn't understand. But 2.5 months later, you wipe out on literature altogether. You run out of time in the graduate program, and still no dis. Your husband says, no kids until you finish, but you can't finish. The thesis isn't even embarrassing. Psychoanalytic readings reek of 6 years ago, and this new post-structural stuff gives you hives. You crash and burn. The house goes to pot. You glue yourself to the Watergate hearings for weeks. The whole mad circus is like a Dickens serial saga. You talk to the screen, cheering and hissing. You even develop a little thing for Sam Irvin. You get a job adjuncting at a nearby college, intros and surveys. But drumming up enthusiasm for Wharton and Cather is hard. These days it's all Pynchon and Barthelme, Coover and Gaddis and Gass. The canon goes up in smoke. You realize belatedly that you're a co-opted false consciousness servant of empire, a capo of privileged heteronormative white paternalism, but it's too late to retool. Around the fall of Saigon, plagued by those films of people on the embassy rooftop clutching the runners of escaping helicopters, you bail out into law school. It's the only practical choice. And isn't law at bottom all about the same act of eternal verbal negotiation as reading? The marriage breaks up under the pressure of L1, and your only recreational reading for the next 2 years is the congressional record. You get a good job with a decent boutique firm specializing in intellectual property. None of your dozens of bright, well-read colleagues have ever heard of Wotton on Wold. You marry again, this time for real, to a big police procedural fan in corporate litigation. At the last possible moment, you have kids, 3 of them, 1 reader and 2 watchers who get their ABCs from purple and green television puppets. Nothing will ever light up the cortex faster than cathode rays. Yet with your reader daughter, the whole awful, gut-wrenching seduction happens all over again. Urban ducklings, wild things, purple crayons, it doesn't matter. Your daughter, glazed-eyed and body-snatched, chants, "Read, Mommy, read." Like she's off in Neverland already, even before the first verb. And you, fallen Wendy, eviscerated by the eternal recurrence of it all, hear Peter snarl at you for growing guilty, big, and old, while something inside you cries, "Woman, woman, let go of me." A few years pass, and still your daughter is reading furiously. You'll lose her eventually to the rising flood of film, the swelling archive of video just now offering whole new republics of visual democracy. Who knows how long the page can hold her attention? Do you rush her into the good stuff while you can? Maybe, if you time things right, the whole crumbling Edwardian bewilderment of Wotton on Wold might strike her as some kind of hyper-Narnia. When should you push Wentworth on your Jane? 1, never too early. 2, never too late. 3, never gonna happen. You watch your children's rising action. They become the heroes of their own plots, ancient genres in unrecognizable new bindings. The 80s pass while your energies are spent elsewhere, on building up the college tuition war chests, on making partner, on helping companies copyright common English words. You still read for pleasure, all kinds of things. The hunger is still there. But as with sex, the costumes must grow ever more elaborate to achieve the same transport. You're caught somewhere between reading for recognition and reading for estrangement. Mostly what you read are reviews. Too few hours left to do more than scan all the books that you know you'd love. At least you can read what the gatekeepers say about this fall's lineup. And often, imagining a book from its synopsis beats what you do manage to slog through. The reviews accumulate faster than you can flip through them. What you really need is a thumbnail summary of the thumbnail summaries. A year or so after Grenada or Iran-Contra or some such thing, while blasting through last year's stack of unread New Yorkers prior to pitching them, you come across the fact that To the Measure's Fall, long out of print, is being reissued in an annotated Essential Library edition, part of a general renaissance of Wentworth, who, the review laments, has been in a 20-year decline. The review recalls Measures the once celebrated, now forgotten British Magic Mountain. He claims that Wentworth's wartime Midlands might once have had what might once more have as much to reveal as any of the marginalized regions of the earth. Can that possibly include Lesotho, Lebanon, the Punjab? The retrospective appreciation feels like one of those lifetime achievement awards that you get for having the courtesy of staying dead. The new covers for the Essential Library edition are dazzling. The one for Measures makes Wentworth look like the next Alice Walker. You're not sure what constitutes a decent interval between much revered national asset and unfairly undervalued. For the reviewer, the revival proves that the one universal truth about literary merit: quality will eventually surface in the run of time. The trick is to stop time at just the right moment. Who is Elton Wentworth exactly? Choose one. One, the formerly most unjustly underrated author of his generation. Two, the even more formerly most justly overrated author of his generation. Three, the currently least unjustly re-rated author of his generation. New annotated copies flood the market. Does your boat go up? You break down and pay an appraiser 10 times what you would have 10 years ago to look at your copy. Churchill's marked up volume, it turns out, went off at Sotheby's for £900, just as the new Wentworth Renaissance hit. Your copy belonged to a Cotswold sheep farmer named H.H. Cleanleach. The appraiser offers you $10 off his fee. The boys in information processing install a terminal in your office that fulfills your old dream: rapid access to abstracts of all the articles you can no longer afford to read. In between researching briefs, you follow the boomlet in Wentworth studies. The reader response people take him up. Then those who study reputational revision. There's a minor heyday in swarming any author still in the state of pre-post exhaustion, just before the idea of single author studies gives out. A modernist at New Mexico State proves that To the Measure's Fall was really written around 1928, suppressed by Wentworth for 2 decades, then published over his objections in a form he didn't want. A Barnard Associate Prof proves that half of the novel was the work of Wentworth's longtime mistress. A graduate student at Indiana proves the book is riddled with historical error. Scholars of all rank show how Wentworth was the product of 1,000 horrific cultural blindnesses and Eurocentric brutalities. Write a brief letter to no one about what you once thought the book might mean. The Berlin Wall falls and the evil empire falls with it. The Cold War ends, and for a moment, history does too. You stop reading much of anything that isn't at least 20 years old. You don't exactly remember the 90s. The Gulf, of course, something about Somalia and Sarajevo, smoke everywhere, lots of variously colored ribbons tied around America's trees. The firm keeps dangling the promise of senior partnership, but it never quite happens. The 1993 feature film adaptation of To the Measures Fall stars Daniel Day-Lewis and Emma Thompson. There's an extended hallucinatory sequence depicting the suicidal slow walk at the Somme, filmed in Scotland, graphically matched to a torrid sex scene on the heath outside Watton-on-Wold, filmed in a Hollywood sound studio. A tie-in paperback edition appears with a glossy movie still cover featuring the gorgeous leads. Rate the film. Worth a theater ticket? Worth videotaping when it comes to TV? Worth denouncing at a dinner party? Worth a class action suit by readers everywhere? On your 55th birthday, the age when terminally ill Sarah Beck must identify her son's body at the foot of the Cotswolds gravel pit, you join a book group. The kids are grown, the career's on autopilot, the husband is off playing paintball, and it's time to read again. Books are back in more flavors than ever. Cool books, slick books, innovative remixes, massive doorstops, funny jeux d'esprit, weepy Uyghur Bildungsromans, caustic family sagas from Kazakhstan, books in every market niche and biome, avant, après, post, retro. Back, too, is the long-dead art of communal reading. Okay, maybe a few of your book group members are in it for the finger food, but you've forgotten what a pleasure it is to discuss out loud. Aimless talk about love and lust, responsibility, hope, and pain. Together, over a couple of years, you read the major national selections. Your fellow members bring their old secret freight out of deep storage. You take 9 months to work up your request. You're unsure of your friends, unsure of your ability to reread, unsure of just what's in that treacherous and mutable book these days. You read it slowly this time, a chapter a night over the course of weeks. This time, though, the book is no more than a grand, futile gesture of nevertheless in the face of human frailty. Francis Beck's refusal to believe that his wife is ill, a feckless cowardice that turns by insistence almost heroic. Alice Wright's paralyzing premonition that she can't act upon without destroying the man who would destroy her. Trevor's premeditated signal to Alice, ready to launch itself from beyond the grave. 2 club members report flinging the book across the room in rage. Another demands her 13 hours back. Accusations multiply. It's mawkish. It's cerebral. It's meandering. It's manipulative. It's cold and cunning and misanthropic. It's wrecked by redemption. How are we supposed to care about these characters? I just wanted them all to get a life. But a few of the group don't know what hit them. One friend hated the first 50 pages, but wanted 50 more at the end. The quietest man in the group comes back from Watton-on-Wold, wrapped in brittle bewilderment at his own existence. It's the custom of the group, introduced by the male minority, of assigning every book a letter grade. Yours gets a C+. What % of your pleasure has gone out of the book forever? Fractional numbers permitted. Overnight, the World Wide Web weaves tightly around you. A novelty at first, then invaluable, then life support, then heroin. It's a chance to find everything you've ever lost. College friends, out-of-print rarities, quotes that had vanished forever. Your online hours must come from somewhere, and it isn't your TV viewing. You lose whole days on the roller coaster of real-time eBay auctions. Volumes of Wentworth go off at every price from triple digits down to $1.99. You rescue a few to give to friends someday or whenever. It thrills you to discover a site where all the shameless recidivist Wentworth readers in the world gather to post their guilty pleasures. You subscribe to a feed. 6 months later, the community spirals into civil war as a thread between sock puppets and anonymous avatars goes up in flames. You watch the Amazon ratings for To the Measures fall steadily, from a high of 4.3 to a low somewhat below that of a defective wood chipper. The wisdom of crowds means to send Wentworth into a third and final eclipse. You consider logging in at comfort suites across the country, creating all kinds of persona to rescue the book for another generation of Wentworth readers whenever they come back to the Earth's surface. How many aliases do you create to rate the book? 1. Just enough to boost the book back to its rightful rating. 2. Sarah Beck would never create an alias. Then the new century. Terror and sci-fi become life's dominant genres. War turns perpetual. The last print newspaper disappears. More words get posted in 5 years than were published in all previous history. Global warming floods the coastal areas inhabited by 500 million people. 1/10 of the planet dies of drought and tainted water. Name the book that best captures life as now lived. 2 months before you plan to retire, you learn you have a massive hilar tumor nestled up in the stem of your lungs where nothing can reach it. It's right where Sarah Beck's was, if you imagine right. Your daughter, the reader, brings you the book to keep you company in a state-of-the-art cancer center, in your bed near a window that opens out onto a brick wall 10 feet across a cement courtyard. You read it again. Not the whole book, of course. You couldn't possibly read a whole of anything. But you manage a few pages looking for a creature that recedes in front of your gaze. This time, the book is about the shifting delusion of shared need, our imprisonment in something as traceless as air. It's about a girl who knew nothing at all, taking a bike ride through the Cotswolds one ridiculous spring, mistaking books for life and those rolling hills of metaphor for truth. It's about a little flash, glimpsed for half a paragraph at the bottom of a left-hand page that fills you with something almost like knowing. A freak snow hits late that year. You lie in bed an hour from your next morphine, your swollen index finger marking a secret place in the spine-cracked volume, the passage that predicted your life. For a moment, you are lucid and equal to any story. Score the world on a scale from 1 to 10. Say what you'd like to see happen in the sequel.
Wow. I think we're all going to give it a 10, which is, in the words of Stan, the generosity of insight to this, and we all thank you very much for that. This is going to be a hard festival to match or come close to, but before we leave our plenary and are all together, I did want to mention something that you might see at the back of our program, which is our best attempt to come close to this type of experience when our honoree next year will be Jonathan Franzen, a recognizable name perhaps, and we also hope to have it here in the sanctuary at the UUCR. Just a few announcements again. One is that I think we've all had a wonderful experience, and we'd like to know that by you filling out the evaluation form that was included in your folder. That would really be a help to us. It also includes the idea of suggestions for improvements and who you'd like to see and things of that nature. We have about 10 minutes or so before the events start at 3:30. I am very envious of our scholars who are going to be spending another hour with our honoree and Stan. I'd all love to do that. But it might be possible for some book signing before that takes place. And there are some spots outside for some book signings from workshop leaders, and perhaps we can have book signings here from Richard and Stan and Alice up here, if that's possible, in that 10 minutes, for those people who have to go to a workshop and are not going to stay around. I guess the only other thing to say is that those people who have registered for the tour, the Fitzgerald tour, it will take place right outside here at about 3:35. And I think we are all, unfortunately or fortunately, we are all filled up. So with that, I want to let you go to your various interests and hope to see you all next year. Thank you.